Korea, December 26, 1950. The temperature is 17 degrees below zero. A jeep rolls through the wreckage of what used to be a front line. On both sides of the road, American soldiers are moving south. Not in formation, not with weapons at the ready. They are walking, heads down, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow with exhaustion and something worse than exhaustion. Defeat. Trucks pass loaded with men who are not wounded, who are not ill, who have simply decided, with every cell in their bodies, that they do not want to be here anymore. South Korean units are streaming down the same road in complete disorder, without leaders, without rifles, without anything except the desperate wish to survive. The man in the jeep watches all of this in silence. He is 55 years old. He is wearing a standard field jacket, unremarkable except for one detail. Strapped to the front of his chest, one on each side, are two objects. One is a live fragmentation grenade. The other is a first aid kit. Not the medals of a general, not the polished insignia of a man arriving to give a speech from a safe command post. A grenade. His name is Lieutenant General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, and he has arrived to save a war that almost everyone, from the Pentagon to the press to the terrified men on this frozen road, had already written off as lost. In the weeks that follow, those two objects strapped to his chest will become the most famous items of equipment in the entire Korean War. Soldiers will talk about them. Reporters will photograph them. Officers will whisper about what they mean. His men will give him a nickname that is not, strictly speaking, fit to print, but which, in the dark humor of men under fire, contains within it an entire philosophy of command. And Ridgway himself, years later, will say something about those grenades that cut straight to the heart of what it means to lead. This is that story. If you want more stories like this one, where history gets personal, where the details matter, where the men behind the medals come alive, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We don't sensationalize, we don't guess. Every word is verified, every story is real. To understand why Matthew Ridgway wore a grenade on his chest, you first have to understand the kind of man he was and where that man came from. He was born on March 3, 1895 at Fort Monroe, Virginia. His father was a colonel in the artillery. His earliest memories, as he wrote in his memoirs, were of guns and marching men, of reveille at dawn and taps at night. The Army was not just a profession for Matthew Ridgway, it was the air he breathed from birth. He graduated from West Point in 1917, a year that would have put him on the fields of France just in time for the worst slaughter in the history of Western warfare. Instead, he was assigned as a Spanish instructor at West Point itself, a bureaucratic decision that kept him safe and that he resented for years. He spent the following decades doing exactly what ambitious officers did in the peacetime army, moving from post to post, learning languages, studying tactics, absorbing the craft of war through every channel available to him. China, Nicaragua, the Philippines, Fort Leavenworth, Carlisle Barracks. He was by any measure one of the most thoroughly educated soldiers in the American Army by the time the 1940s arrived. But education is not the same as experience. And Matthew Ridgway, in the autumn of 1942, was given the command that would answer the question he had been carrying since 1917. He was made commanding general of the 82nd Infantry Division. At the precise moment, it was being transformed into something new, something no American division had ever been before, an airborne division. The concept was radical. You load soldiers onto aircraft, fly them over enemy territory in the dark, and push them out the door. They fall through the sky with rifles and mortars and machine guns, and they land, if they are lucky, somewhere close to where they are supposed to be, often behind enemy lines, often completely cut off from support, with orders to hold an objective until ground forces can reach them. If they are unlucky, they land in a swamp or a river or a German machine gun position. Ridgway embraced it completely. He understood with the instinct of a born soldier that airborne warfare required a particular kind of officer. Not a manager, not a planner, a fighter. A man who would jump into the darkness with his soldiers, stand in the same snow, eat the same cold rations, and accept the same odds of being killed before morning. In July 1943, during the Allied invasion of Sicily, Ridgway led the 82nd Airborne in what was the first large-scale American airborne operation of the war. It was chaotic. The winds were wrong. Paratroopers were scattered across miles of rocky terrain. Some were shot by their own anti-aircraft guns. Many landed miles from their objectives. But they fought, and Ridgway was among them. In June 1944, he jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He was one of the first American general officers to land in France. While other commanders tracked the invasion on maps and command ships offshore, Ridgway was in a field in the dark, under fire, leading men who could not see 10 feet in any direction. He was wounded at least once before the war in Europe ended. In March 1945, during Operation Varsity, the great airborne crossing of the Rhine, Ridgway and his party ran into a German patrol at midnight. A firefight erupted. As Ridgway was reloading his weapon, a German grenade exploded beneath his jeep. A fragment struck him in the shoulder. The doctors told him it should come out. He refused. Matthew Ridgway carried that piece of German steel in his shoulder for the rest of his life. He died in 1993 at 98 years old. The fragment was still there. Think about that for a moment. A man who kept a piece of German shrapnel in his body for nearly 50 years, not out of stubbornness, not as a trophy, but simply because removing it seemed like an inconvenience he did not have time for, not when there was still work to be done. That is the man who arrived in Korea on December 26, 1950. To understand what Ridgway found when he arrived, you need to understand how the Korean War had fallen apart in the space of just a few weeks. It had begun so well. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur's bold amphibious landing at Incheon had cut the North Korean army in half. What had been an apparently unstoppable communist advance down the Korean peninsula was suddenly reversed. American and United Nations forces drove north across the 38th parallel deep into North Korea. By late October, some units were approaching the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur was triumphant. The war, he told reporters, would be over by Christmas. Then China entered the war. On the night of November 25, 26, 1950, more than 200,000 Chinese soldiers who had crossed the Yalu River in secret, moving at night, hiding in the forests by day, launched one of the most devastating surprise offensives in American military history. They came in darkness and in silence, blowing bugles and trumpets, swarming over the frozen hills in human waves that American commanders had been told were impossible. In 2 weeks, the entire UN advance collapsed. Units that had been on the Yalu were now retreating south. The word used in American newspapers was bug out. Soldiers threw down equipment to run faster. Officers lost contact with their units. The 8th Army, once the conqueror of North Korea, was a force in free fall. On December 23, 1950, Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commander of the 8th Army, was killed when his jeep collided with a South Korean military truck north of Seoul. It was a shattering moment. An army already close to breaking had just lost its general. That night, Ridgway received a phone call in Washington. The Army Chief of Staff told him that Walker was dead. The 8th Army needed a new commander. Would Ridgway go? He said yes before the question was fully asked. He was given 24 hours to prepare. He spent much of that time simply thinking. Not about strategy, not yet, but about what he was walking into. He had read the dispatches. He knew what was happening, but he wanted to understand it at a deeper level. Why was an army of American soldiers, trained and equipped and proud, coming apart? He believed he knew the answer, and he believed he knew the cure. When Ridgway landed in Korea on December 26, 1950, he went immediately to the front. Not to a command post, not to a briefing room with maps and telephones, to the front. He drove north in a jeep in the bitter cold, and he looked at the men on the road. He stopped his jeep and got out and talked to them, not speeches, conversations. He asked them where they were from, what their unit was, what was wrong. What he found appalled him. These were not men who had been broken by superior force. They were men who had been broken by poor leadership. They were men who had not been told why they were fighting. They were men whose officers had vanished when things got hard. They were men who had been kept in the dark, left without information, treated as bodies to be moved rather than soldiers to be led. He wrote later in his book The Korean War that he interviewed soldiers in field hospitals. Men who were not badly wounded, who should have been eager to return to their units. Instead, they sat quietly looking at the floor. Dispirited, without the fire that American soldiers almost always showed when they were not too badly hurt. He understood then that what the 8th Army had lost was not its strength. It had lost its pride. And pride, in Matthew Ridgway's view of war, was not a luxury. It was a weapon. He wrote a letter. He had it distributed to every soldier in the 8th Army, down to the last private. The letter explained in plain language why the United Nations was fighting in Korea. It addressed the men as adults, as citizens, as soldiers who deserved to know what they were risking their lives for. Then he started visiting units. Every day in his Jeep, with those two objects strapped to his chest, he went to the front. He ate in field kitchens, he shook hands, he asked questions. He relieved officers he considered incompetent, and he relieved them without ceremony, right there at the front, in front of their men, because he wanted everyone to see that performance was what mattered, not rank. He ordered his division commanders to do the same. Get out of your command posts, go forward, let your men see you. The grenade and the first aid kit on his chest were not decorations. They were a message. I am not here to observe. I am here to fight. I have what I need to hurt the enemy and to help my wounded. I am not behind you. I am with you. The soldiers noticed. How could they not? He was a 3-star general walking around the front with a live grenade on his chest. Some thought it was theater. Some thought it was the eccentricity of a man who had been in too many wars. Some thought he was showing off. He was asked about it years later in a 1982 interview. His answer was characteristically direct. Some people thought I wore the grenades as a gesture of showmanship. This was not correct. They were purely utilitarian. Many a time in Europe and in Korea, men in tight spots blasted their way out with grenades. That was all. No elaboration, no philosophy. A grenade was a useful tool, and he liked to have useful tools within reach. It was the same instinct that had made him refuse to let a surgeon remove the fragment from his shoulder. Every tool had its purpose. Every wound had its lesson. What happened next in Korea was one of the most remarkable turnarounds in American military history. Within weeks of Ridgway's arrival, the 8th Army stopped retreating. The bug out, a phrase that had become a bitter shorthand for everything that had gone wrong, stopped. Ridgway reorganized his defensive lines with ruthless attention to terrain. He used artillery with a ferocity that Chinese commanders had not anticipated. When the Chinese attacked, and they attacked with the same human wave tactics that had broken the army in November, they now ran into coordinated fire from artillery and mortars that cut through their ranks with terrible precision. The Chinese, who had few trucks and fewer supply lines, were operating at the far edge of their logistical reach. They were brave, but they were hungry and they were cold. In late January 1951, Ridgway launched his first counteroffensive. He called it Operation Thunderbolt. It was not flashy, it was not bold. It was methodical, grinding step by step. What he called a meat grinder. Advance, consolidate, prepare, advance again. Never outrun your artillery, never expose a flank. Use your advantages, firepower and logistics and air support, and deny the enemy his advantage, which was mass and momentum, and the willingness to absorb casualties that American commanders found almost incomprehensible. The Chinese and North Koreans pushed back. On New Year's Eve, they launched a massive offensive that forced Ridgway to abandon Seoul for the second time. He gave up the city without panic, trading space for time, keeping his forces intact, wearing down the enemy's strength against his prepared positions. Seoul fell again, and then, in a matter of weeks, Ridgway took it back. By March 1951, fewer than 100 days after he had arrived in Korea with an army on the verge of collapse, United Nations forces were back at or near the 38th parallel. The war that had seemed lost was, if not won, at least stable. The army that had been streaming south in disorder was advancing north in formation. General Omar Bradley, the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would later say that Ridgway's performance in Korea was the greatest feat of personal leadership in the history of the Army. That is not a small claim. Bradley had served with Eisenhower, Patton, and Marshall. He had seen the greatest military commanders of the 20th century at work, and he said that specifically and deliberately about Matthew Ridgway. Then came the crisis that Ridgway himself had not chosen, but could not avoid. General Douglas MacArthur was one of the most famous soldiers in American history. He had commanded Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II. He had accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri. He was 70 years old, brilliant, vain, imperious, and increasingly convinced that the political constraints being placed on his command in Korea were both wrong and cowardly. MacArthur wanted to attack China directly. He wanted to bomb the supply bases across the Yalu River. He wanted to unleash the Chinese nationalist forces on Taiwan against the mainland. He believed that half measures would prolong the war indefinitely. President Harry Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff believed that attacking China directly risked a third world war, possibly a nuclear one. They had drawn a line. MacArthur refused to respect it. In March and April of 1951, MacArthur began publicly undermining Truman's strategy. He wrote letters to Republican congressional leaders. He issued a military ultimatum to the Chinese commander, publicly without authorization, that contradicted American diplomatic efforts. He was, in Ridgway's measured phrase in his 1967 book, engaged in a clash of wills bordering closely on insubordination. On April 11, 1951, President Truman removed MacArthur from command. It was one of the most controversial decisions in American political history. MacArthur returned home to a ticker tape parade in New York and a speech before Congress that ended with the famous line about old soldiers fading away. Millions of Americans believed Truman had committed an outrage. Ridgway said nothing publicly. He was now the supreme commander of all United Nations forces in Korea, and he understood with the discipline of a man who had spent his entire life in the army that the principle at stake, civilian control of the military, was not negotiable. Whatever he thought of the decision, whatever he thought of MacArthur the man, the Constitution was the Constitution. He moved to Tokyo, he took over the headquarters, he continued the war. The stalemate set in. Armistice negotiations began in the summer of 1951 and would drag on for 2 more years. Ridgway left Korea in May 1952, replaced by General Mark Clark, to become Supreme Allied Commander Europe, replacing Eisenhower, who had returned home to run for president. The war he had saved would not end until July 1953. There is one more detail about those grenades that deserves to be told. A detail that the history books usually leave out. The object on Ridgway's left chest in most of the photographs taken during the Korean War was not a grenade. It was a first aid kit, a battlefield dressing. Look at the photographs carefully, and there are many of them, and you can see the difference. On one side, the smooth, segmented oval of a fragmentation grenade. On the other, a field dressing packet. Some people noticed at the time. Others assumed both were grenades and reported it that way. Ridgway never made a point of correcting anyone. Why not? Because the message was the same either way. I carry what I need to fight. I carry what I need to help the wounded. I am not a general in the abstract. I am a soldier. I am here with you, and I am ready. The first aid kit was, in its own way, more eloquent than the grenade. A general who carries his own field dressing is a general who does not expect someone else to patch him up if things go wrong. A general who carries his own grenade is a general who does not expect someone else to clear the way. Both together said, I have thought about what I might need, and I have brought it with me. That is leadership in the oldest sense of the word. Not management, not strategy. Presence. Matthew Ridgway retired from the Army on June 30th, 1955. He was 60 years old. In retirement, he was anything but quiet. He fought, publicly and vigorously, against American involvement in Vietnam, arguing as early as 1954 that a land war in Asia could not be won on acceptable terms. He was invited by President Lyndon Johnson to the White House in 1968 to consult on the war, and he told Johnson what he had always told everyone, the truth as he saw it, whether it was welcome or not. He published his memoirs, Soldier, in 1956. He wrote The Korean War in 1967. Both books are still in print. Both books reward the reader with something increasingly rare in military memoir. A man willing to examine his own decisions with genuine honesty, who gives credit to the soldiers under him, and who takes responsibility for his failures with the same directness he expected from everyone else. President Ronald Reagan awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom on May 12, 1986. Reagan's citation read, in part, "Heroes come when they're needed. Great men step forward when courage seems in short supply." He was 91 years old when he received that medal. He died on July 26, 1993 in Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania. He was 98 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where soldiers who have kept their word to their country are laid to rest. The piece of German shrapnel was buried with him. What does it mean, finally, that a general wore a grenade on his chest? It would be easy to make it symbolic, to say it represented his philosophy of leadership, his belief in presence over distance, his contempt for the safe comfort of the rear command post. All of that is true, but Ridgway would have been irritated by the symbolism. He wore the grenade because grenades are useful. He wore the first aid kit because wounds happen. He went to the front because that was where the information was, and where the men were, and where the decisions had to be made. There is a lesson in that bluntness that goes beyond military history. The organizations that work, armies, companies, families, communities, tend to be led by people who are actually present. Not present in the sense of standing nearby with a clipboard, but present in the way Ridgway was present. Ready to act, ready to help, ready to absorb the same conditions as the people they are leading. The soldiers of the Eighth Army knew that their general was out there with them, in the cold, with a grenade on his chest. They knew it not because someone told them, but because they could see him. And seeing him, a man with that kind of authority choosing to be in that kind of cold, changed something in them. That is what pride feels like when it comes back. That is what a broken army feels like when it remembers what it is. In December 1950, the Eighth Army was retreating in disorder toward a peninsula it might not be able to hold. In March 1951, it was advancing through a rebuilt front line, back toward the parallel it had been told to defend. Nothing changed between those two moments except leadership. One man, one jeep, one live grenade, and one first aid kit, and the absolute refusal to pretend that a general was something other than a soldier. General Matthew Bunker Ridgway never forgot what he was. And because he never forgot, neither did the men who served under him. That is why he wore the grenade. And that is why we should remember him. If this story moved you, and if you learned something today, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and ring that notification bell because these stories deserve to be told, and there are many more to come. The men who changed history rarely made the front pages. They made the difference. We're here to find them.